Great. Thank you, Jess. So this is the Hudson River Flood Resilient Network's State Revolving Fund training. Thanks again for everyone for joining us today. And if you haven't already, please go ahead and introduce yourself and your affiliation and location in the chat. And then we want to thank our funders, our sponsors for this program, the Hudson River Estuary Program at the New York State Department of Environmental Conservation in cooperation with the New York State Water Resources Institute at Cornell University. So for those of you, we've expanded this training opportunity a little bit beyond the Flood Resilience Network membership. So just as a quick introduction, the Hudson River Flood Resilience Network connects local governments who are committed to taking actionable steps to manage current and future flood risk. The network is co-facilitated by the Hudson River Watershed Alliance, New York Sea Grant, the Consensus Building Institute, and the Hudson River Estuary Program. And right now we are wrapping up a strategic roadmap to set our direction for the coming years. And we're really looking forward to sharing more information about with you all quite soon. So today is World Water Day. Happy World Water Day, everyone. It's a great day to talk about infrastructure and flooding and resilience. Before I hand it over to the team from River Network, I wanted to mention a few updates from New York State. The Environmental Facilities Corporation has a new community assistance teams program to support municipal water infrastructure projects. They are providing assistance for planning, submitting funding applications, and helping see projects through to completion. And there's more information at the link. And Jess is dropping some of those pieces of information and links in the chat as well. If you haven't already, we encourage you to participate in the Clean Watershed Needs Survey by March 31st. This is a national survey that's sponsored by the US EPA, which is intended to be every 4 years, but the last one was in 2012. And this is a really important opportunity to submit your community's needs and cost documentation to New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation because it helps federal lawmakers decide how much money actually goes to New York State. So you can get more information at that link. It'll be in the chat as well. And eligible projects for the Clean Watershed Needs Survey include wastewater, both centralized and decentralized, and stormwater, green and gray infrastructure, and non-point source projects. And the contact I spoke with at EFC mentioned that this includes things like culvert replacements, stream restoration, dam removal, agricultural best management practices. So while the Clean Watershed Needs Survey has a water quality component, obviously, wastewater infrastructure that's vulnerable to flooding, stormwater management projects that can help reduce localized flooding, all of those are eligible. And especially if you have cost documentation, if you have a culvert plan or a green infrastructure plan with some costs associated, it'll be great to submit those to EFC. Last piece, next Thursday, Environmental Facilities Corporation and the US EPA Region 2 are offering a webinar on current water infrastructure funding for municipalities. They will cover details on state revolving funds, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, and several other opportunities. And you can register for that webinar with the Eventbrite link, which will also be in the chat. So an opportunity to get some more information about how some of the bipartisan infrastructure law funding will be coming through, some of the Bond Act funding as well. So that's it from me. Thank you all again for joining us today. And so with that, I will hand it over to Sheyda and Erin.
Thanks, Emily. I'm going to share my screen. This guy. Okay, you all can see that? We're good to go. Okay, thank you. Yeah, and thanks for setting us up so nicely, Emily, with all the additional events and information. My name is Sheyda Esnaashari. I'm the Drinking Water Program Director with River Network, and we're really just going to scratch the surface today, I think, with the SRFs and provide you lots of opportunities for next steps. And I think this will go nicely with the webinar that's being hosted next week. So again, I'm Sheyda. I'm based in Washington, D.C. on Piscataway and Anacostan land. I'm going to be presenting today with my colleague, Erin. Erin, do you want to just jump on and say hi?
Hi, I'm Erin Kanzig. I'm the River Programs Policy and Research Associate at River Network. and I'm calling in from Detroit, Michigan on Anishinaabe land. Nice to be with you all.
Thanks, Erin. So yeah, before we get started on talking about SRFs, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on who River Network is. I know that colleagues of ours have already been working with you all on some strategic planning initiatives. We are a capacity building and network-based organization that offers several different services, but really focused on building the capacity of water, justice, and river advocates to address all sorts of water issues. And we envision a powerful and inclusive movement that ensures abundant clean water for all people and nature to thrive. We're headquartered in Boulder, but as you can tell, we have staff all over the place. And we work across several different water issue areas. We've been doing this work for just over 30 years now. So we just went through a strategic planning process, something we called our strategic refresh. And really it was a process of revisiting our previous strategic plan and revising our mission and vision and goals as they relate to our key focus areas, which are pictured here. So healthy and resilient rivers, safe and affordable drinking water, and climate resilient communities. And our focus areas really frame our work and how we move toward the future we envision for people and nature. You can check out our strategic plan if you're interested. It was just released at the end of last year. So just a brief overview of the things we're hoping to cover today. So we did want to provide a bit of historical context on the SRFs themselves and the state of water infrastructure in the US and what the need is and what the opportunities are with the SRFs or the state revolving funds. Talk a little bit about current and new funding for the SRFs. If you're familiar with them at all, you might know that there's been consistent funding for the SRFs, but recently with the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, there's a lot more money over the next few years. We'll cover how these dollars flow from the federal level, who the key stakeholders are at each level, and the decision points and opportunities for engagement. And then we'll talk a little bit about support for accessing the SRFs, focusing on technical assistance and the role of the environmental finance centers, as well as other resources. We've asked a colleague from an organization called Quantified Ventures to join us here, who is, they are an environmental finance center just recently, and they're very involved, made up of lots of folks who've been involved in SRF and administration. And so they'll be around to answer questions at the end, as well as Erin and I. So that's a little bit about where we're headed today. And before we dive in, I just wanted to get a sense of who we have in the room and what your familiarity is with water infrastructure. So maybe just by show of hands, who would qualify themselves as a beginner, that you're not very familiar with this topic? Okay. And how about our intermediate folks? You've had some experience, but you're looking to learn more. I'm going to guess there's going to be a lot of those. Okay. Cool. Thank you. And then who are our advanced people? Who is this old hat for? Anyone? Okay. Sounds good. Okay, let's dig into it. I think we have a little bit of a spread, and I think this presentation will cover bases for all. So let's just start with the history of the state revolving funds. Sorry, can you say that again?
Or if you're, can everyone please mute themselves? Thanks.
Thank you. So first of all, when we talk about the state revolving funds, we're talking about two primary programs, the Clean Water State Revolving Fund and the Drinking Water State Revolving Fund. Both of these programs were established as part of larger federal policies, namely the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act. So the Clean Water SRF itself was the first one, and it replaced something called the Construction Grants Program, an emphasis on the word grants there, because I think that's information for providing some context about where we've been and where we're at. That program delivered grants directly to municipalities for much of our current infrastructure. And that was happening in the 1970s. Following that, the Clean Water SRF was established through the Clean Water Act in 1987 as a loan program. So this is the first time we see it shift from a grants program to a primarily loan program. We'll talk about distinctions there in a moment. The Drinking Water State Revolving Fund followed and was established in 1996 in the Safe Drinking Water Act. These programs are called revolving loan funds because the money in them revolves. How novel. Funding is given out primarily as low interest loans, and repayment goes back into the fund for future projects. There are some caveats there on things that are given as grants or forgivable loans. The main takeaway here, though, is that the programs have been around for decades, but this did originally exist as a grant program. So let's talk a little bit about the need for water infrastructure funding. So we know that funding for water infrastructure has declined since the 1970s, particularly federal funding for water infrastructure. And that includes this moving from a grant to a loan program and just the dollar amount that has been available. And it has not kept pace with infrastructure needs. So there's several reasons for this. We know that several communities are dealing with overbuilt infrastructure, so they've experienced population loss or loss of income or both. And the water infrastructure that was needed decades ago is no longer needed or no longer representative of the need of that community. We have a lot of old infrastructure that has not been maintained, a lot of that because of many factors, population loss, declining incomes, and again, just a lack of investment in water infrastructure relative to several decades ago. And the main takeaway here is that the need for water infrastructure investment is much greater than available resources. The SRFs do represent the largest source of federal funding for water infrastructure investment. Like I said, they are primarily available as low interest loans. Several different kinds of projects are funded under the Clean Water and the Drinking Water SRFs. Some examples include addressing Safe Drinking Water Act and Clean Water Act compliance needs. This includes filtration and disinfection of drinking water, source water protection, as well as incorporating more green and nature-based solutions toward more climate resilient communities. So lots more, EPA has lots of resources on the types of projects that can be funded, and we'll go over a little bit later the SRF advocacy toolkit that we've pulled together, which goes into a lot more detail on the kinds of projects that can be funded through the SRFs. I wanted to provide a little bit of more context on the need for SRFs and the historic barriers to accessing them. So we know that even though these are the largest source of federal funding, they have not been accessed equally or equitably. And that the SRFs have a history of not going to communities that need it most. I think there are several factors that contribute to that. Some of it is that it's a highly technical and bureaucratic process, as with many programs that flow from the federal level to state implementation and flow to local communities. We also know that several communities have low capacity to go after not only the SRFs, but other forms of government and federal funding. This gap typically falls along lines of race and class. These communities are more likely to face environmental injustice and be unable to access the resources available to address those issues. And we also know that compliance with federal regulations is also less enforced in environmental justice communities. So this is kind of a self-fulfilling cycle. And so the need is to both break down barriers to the process and address the inequities by identifying and directing those funds to these communities, often called disadvantaged communities, which we'll go into in more detail a little bit later. So at River Network, our focus is really on equitable water infrastructure investment. And this is what we mean by that, or this is how we define it. We define equitable water infrastructure investment as directed by the community toward public health, clean, safe, affordable, and accessible water. That it is supportive of the quality and ecological integrity of our streams, rivers, lakes, and other waterways. That it is distributed intentionally to support low income and communities of color most at risk from environmental harm and historic lack of investment, and that it enhances the long-term and technical and fiscal health of water systems, utilities, and wastewater systems. So here's where I want to provide a little bit more detail on what's been made available through the bipartisan infrastructure law, which some of this really goes toward that interest in equitable investment in water infrastructure by outlining some very specific provisions. So it was passed in 2021, if you're not familiar, and it provides almost $50 billion on top of base funding for the clean water and drinking water SRF. So Erin's going to talk about in a moment how the money flows and the role of Congress in appropriating funding for those base funds. So the bipartisan infrastructure law provides funding on top of that over 5 years. So it goes through 2026. And like I said, it has several components that aim to move this program toward more equitable implementation and outcomes. So some of the examples of this are for the general supplemental. This is for like on top of the general base funding for the clean water and the drinking water SRF. 49%, the directive is that 49% of these funds are given as grants or forgivable loans to disadvantaged communities, which we'll talk a little bit more about how those are defined. And this is also true for funding for lead service line replacement. 49% of those are to be given as grants or forgivable loans. So this goes against the low interest loan piece, and that funding will be available as grants or forgivable loans. In addition to that, there's funding for emerging contaminants like PFAS and dealing with that. If you've been following the news, there's a new MCL for PFAS directed from the EPA. So this is part of addressing that. So through the drinking water SRF emerging contaminants portion, 100% loan forgiveness should be given for the drinking water SRF portion, and 25% of those dollars are to be directed to disadvantaged communities. And then there's also funding in the clean water SRF for emerging contaminants, and again, with 100% loan forgiveness. So we know that a big burden in accessing these funds is not only getting through the process and applying for the funding for communities that really need it, but it's also the burden of repayment. So this is pretty historic in terms of not only the dollar amount that's available, but the amount that is available and being directed toward disadvantaged communities without a repayment requirement. And there's a lot more detail under that and how we actually make sure that happens in those communities that need it most are accessing it, but more than we can probably talk about today. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Erin to tell you a little bit more about Justice 40.
Thanks, Sheyda. Hey, everyone. So you may have heard of Justice 40 already, but I'm just going to give a quick overview of how this connects to state revolving funds. So President Biden signed Executive Order 14008 back in January 2021, right when he first came into office, which established the Justice 40 initiative. Through that executive order, it directed certain federal investments be made toward achieving a goal that 40% of overall benefits flowed to disadvantaged communities. The Council on Environmental Quality was charged with making recommendations on which of those federal programs should be covered, which is what you see on the right-hand side of the slide here. And so importantly, the drinking water and clean water SRFs are considered covered programs. What that means is that EPA should be making a commitment and tracking its commitment toward ensuring that at least 40% of total SRF dollars are benefiting disadvantaged communities. I will say that we don't need to get into it a lot here, but the term disadvantaged communities is defined differently, both federally and at the state level, and is a specific technical term that's used in the drinking water SRF context, and each state is defining it differently. So it can become a little bit confusing around this, but and as Sheyda had shown on the previous slide, the supplemental funding through bill is allocating 49% of funding as forgivable loans or grants. And so those amounts vary within those specific buckets of funding, but the overall goal is that with both supplemental and general funds, 40% is going to be going towards communities that have historically not been able to tap into these resources. I think you can go to the next slide, Sheyda. So here's just a snapshot of how the money flows. Congress appropriates funding each year, and then that goes to the EPA. EPA determines how much each state or territory should receive based on needs assessment. Emily just was mentioning the clean water needs assessment. That actually is not how the clean water SRF funding is allocated. It should be. It's currently determined through a water quality needs formula that hasn't been updated since 1987. So there is some movement to update how that's determined. So states are getting better and more updated dispersal of funds. On the drinking water SRF side, the Drinking Water Infrastructure Needs Survey and Assessment that's conducted every 4 years helps determine how much money each state receives. So from there, EPA is giving capitalization grants to states, and the states provide a match of non-federal funds. That's typically been 20%. Right now, the first 2 years through the bipartisan infrastructure law, that's been reduced to 10%. And as Sheyda said, states don't have to come up with a match for the funding that is specifically for lead service line replacement and emerging contaminants. So really this is a program that's administered by states. Local eligible entities are then submitting applications to their state to apply for funding. And if you go to the next slide, this provides just another way of looking at it, so that this graphic includes the points on the previous slide, but also goes into a little bit more detail. And I'll just note that I'll talk a little bit more about our toolkit that we created soon, but just wanted to say that we have done our best to create visuals and graphics that break down this process in an understandable way. So you can see here some of the different points of the state revolving fund process that includes local, state, and federal actions. And again, here at the end, you can see that once communities are implementing projects, they are then paying back any loan portion, both interest and, sorry, my chat is covering up the slide. Okay, it's covering, they're paying back that funding, so it revolves again, as Sheyda said, back into the pool for future use so that it exists in perpetuity. And I will say also on here, the eligible entities we have listed, you can see that they're slightly different between the clean water and drinking water side of things. And so just to be aware of that as you think about, is this the right kind of funding for your particular organization? I know some of you are from cities and stuff like that. So, you know, just be aware of who is actually eligible to apply. Next slide. And again, here we have just an overview of some of the key roles. What is the role of Congress, the role of states, as well as local governments. And of course, again, from our side of things at River Network, we have included what are the role of advocates, so community members who want to get engaged at those different levels. So for local governments, water and wastewater systems, they're actually going to be the ones that are submitting project applications to the state, carrying out those projects, creating procurement and hiring processes, and then again repaying loans. And a lot of that, again, interfacing will be done with state agencies. So depending on your state, I know like in New York, the health department in conjunction with the finance department, I'm forgetting the name of it, administers the drinking water SRF, and then on the clean water side, the environment department is administering that. So those state agencies develop the criteria to rank projects and are receiving and reviewing those project applications from communities. Next slide. And I just want to touch on this briefly again, like there's a lot to cover in 1 hour, so I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of detail, but like the main document that can serve as a guide to your state's SRF programs is the intended use plan, also known as an IUP. And this IUP really is laying out how a state's program operates, what their priorities and goals are for ensuring that this money is well spent. They also will typically include their project priority list. So whoever has applied, they rank according to criteria, and that's included in the IUP for you to view. And yeah, it's basically a blueprint for how they operate the program. For us, this has been an important place for community members to engage because there is a public comment period on the draft IUP. I think that's all I'll go over for that right now, Sheyda. The next slide has some links that we'll share in the chat as well. If you've never looked at your IUP or don't know where to search for it, there's a couple of great tools out there. One of them is from the Southwest Environmental Finance Center. It's called the SRF Switchboard, and you can click on any state and it'll open up with recent years intended use plans, as well as some other key documents that they've uploaded there, as well as links to the websites for your state SRF program. And then we have also created at River Network a database for the clean water and drinking water SRF agencies by state, as well as contact information. Hopefully up to date, but if you see something wrong, we always appreciate anyone flagging that for us. But we'll share those links as well. Next slide. All right, so another thing to note is that states are using a lot of this money to put actual projects into place. So fixing infrastructure or expanding service to communities that haven't been able to access excuse me, haven't been able to access safe drinking water or wastewater services in the past. However, there are some set-asides of this funding that's allowed to go toward activities other than directly funding projects. And this includes both administrative and technical assistance support. So as Sheyda mentioned, like especially for smaller systems that may not have the capacity to do all the pre-application work necessary to be ready to accept these funds and implement a project, this set-aside funding is crucial so that they can tap into technical assistance and get the help they need to be prepared to achieve these projects. Next slide. One of the ways that this has really grown in recent years is through environmental finance centers, or EFCs. Before the bipartisan infrastructure law, there were 10 EFCs, one for each EPA region, but there's actually been a huge expansion of them. And EFCs help communities across the country access federal funding for infrastructure to improve public health and environmental protection. So they deliver targeted technical assistance to local governments, states, tribes, and NGOs. And we have now had an expansion of both regional water infrastructure EFCs, as well as some new national water infrastructure EFCs. So there's a lot of help out there. And again, EPA has a historic amount of money available. And so they have also recently established a new form which again is at the link on the bottom of this slide, where you can easily request if your community needs technical assistance. EPA is searching for where technical assistance is needed and are all ears in terms of trying to get the word out. So that is a helpful form that we'll share as well. Sheyda, I think you can go to the next slide. And then again, as I mentioned, we developed a toolkit. There's a whole section in there on technical assistance, and there are other amazing TA providers out there, and we include a lot of those examples in the toolkit. So I encourage you to check that out as well. All right, and then I know that you all certainly care about flooding and climate resilience. So I just want to highlight, if you were not aware, that the Clean Water SRF can fund green and natural infrastructure projects. The Green Project Reserve directs at least 10% of states' clean water SRF funds for these types of projects. The example I have up here on the right-hand side of the screen is a project that was completed in Greenville, North Carolina, in response to chronic flooding problems. The city's stormwater utility increased the city's flooding resiliency by installing regenerative stormwater conveyance systems, wetlands, bioretention areas, and permeable pavers, in addition to bolstering their great infrastructure in order to become more climate resilient. So these type of projects can be funded across the states. It's really varied in terms of if they've actually prioritized this in their state as a priority, but we encourage you to check that out as a potential for your community. Next slide. All right, I'm going to just touch on this really quickly because I want to make sure we have time for you all to have some discussion and Q&A. So as I mentioned, River Network has recently published a toolkit. We call it the State SRF Advocacy Toolkit. And you can access it here through this link or this fancy QR code. And again, the image on the slide just sort of shows us the sections that we have within the toolkit. And so you can easily tap which one you would like to explore through our website. Next slide, Sheyda. I always feel like I have to really appreciate all the wonderful folks who helped create the toolkit. We made this in collaboration with the Clean Water for All Coalition, which is a national coalition of organizations working to make sure that everyone has access to affordable water, among other water issues. And then we also pulled together a fantastic advisory committee made up of folks from across the country, as well as some technical reviewers who have more hands-on experience with the SRF program. So I just want to call out those folks here. Next slide. And again, the toolkit is not necessarily directly applicable to you all. We've really aimed it at state and local advocates who are interested in water infrastructure investment, who are seeking to better understand how SRFs work. So mostly nonprofit and community-based water advocates. But that being said, it is a 101 type resource, and it includes a lot of information on the fundamentals of the SRFs, what type of projects are eligible, how the money flows, and how to become engaged. So I encourage you to check out. The reference section can be a useful guide to you as you search out more information as well. Next slide. I don't know if there's anything else. No, okay. So with that, I will close out just by saying that you can feel free to reach out to Sheyda or myself via email. It sounds like you have on deck some other learning opportunities coming up soon related to SRFs, which is great. And again, I believe Sean O'Rourke with Quantified Ventures is on the call too, and he is a great person to talk with. And in fact, if I don't know, Sean, if you want to just do a quick pitch on what Quantified Ventures is up to, feel free. Don't want to put you on the spot, but
Sure.
Yeah, with that, I'll close out and open it up for you all to ask questions, and we'll do our best to answer them. I was just gonna say, sorry, I haven't been looking at the chat, so I don't know if you asked questions already.
Could you say something about the opportunities for nonprofits? There was something on the last slide, but I didn't really catch it.
I think it was the second to last slide, and just highlighting that the SRF toolkit that we pulled together is directed at advocates and identifying the opportunities for advocates to engage in the process, recognizing that there are sometimes limited spaces for them to actually engage in the application process, but they can support in like advocacy around how the state implements it, working with their water utilities or other eligible entities that can apply. So.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yep, and I'm going to start populating the chat with some of the links, and we'll send out our slides as well for you all.
We did have a question in the chat. So on a slide about the kind of the process, the question is, which fund can a New York State approved county water authority apply to? But I think that's between like the one of the two funds.
I think like first order, it depends on the type of project, right? There are distinct types of water infrastructure projects that are funded under the drinking water and the clean water SRF. And then I think underneath that, you might have noticed the list was a bit longer under the clean water SRF in terms of eligible entities. There's some overlap there, but in general, there's more eligibility of different types of entities to apply directly for funds under the clean water SRF. And so I don't know how to answer this question directly, but that there is additional in our toolkit and on EPA's website, there's additional information, and I think it more depends on the type of project and then which fund.
I also got a question directly messaged to me. Will examples be provided suggesting how local projects can be funded? Or will you give some insight about how municipalities can access the state money? I don't know, Kate, if you want to elaborate on your questions and maybe come off mute.
Thanks so much. Yeah, this is Kate Schmidt with Orange County Department of Planning, as well as Orange County Water Authority. So I asked both those questions. This is all great, but it still comes down to the state. And that's why I sent Emily directly this, because the state's going to have to dictate, right, how to release the money, in what ways, and who could apply. And like you said, Sheyda, for really depends on the project, which I didn't think of, but the slide went too fast before I could look at, like you said, the longer list. So I just saw, though, that for clean drinking water, it was utilities, and now the second one was escaping me. But the water authority, for Orange County at least, really doesn't own any water. But we, as a county government, need to help the smaller entities, the towns and villages, how they protect their drinking water, as well as clean water sources, other types of water. So that's why it's still a little vague and fuzzy to me, and maybe it will still get worked out at the state level. We'll get massaged, I'm assuming, but I didn't know if that was coming, because I would like to apply that now. How do I help my municipalities access this? Keeping in mind, New York State has the home rule structure, so that's why it may be different than where Michigan and in DC, certainly. Emily, do you have any insight on this?
I think that might be a good question to bring to the webinar next week about how New York State and EPA Region 2 are implementing some of these projects and funding sources. I did note in the chat that apparently registration is full for that webinar, which is very surprising because it was just announced. So I will check in and see if it's possible to, if it's just the Eventbrite system is full and, maybe there's an opportunity to add some more registrations or view the webinar recording there.
I also just added the EPA TA request form, just the background on their technical assistance that's available. And the messaging that we are getting from Office of Water is, regardless of where you're at in the process, if you have a water issue and you think it may possibly be addressed by the SRFs or some other form of federal funding, just go ahead and send a message. And they are doing their best to do some legwork in identifying whether or not this is an SRF applicable program and how they can support your municipality in accessing those funds. And if it does not fall under the SRFs, they're making connections to like the Office of Environmental Justice and whatever the expanded name of that office is at EPA now. Sean, I see you came off of mute.
Yeah, I just wanted to, thanks, Sheyda. I just wanted to kind of follow up on, exactly what you were just saying, that this is definitely a time to kind of leave no project opportunity behind. And we're hearing the same thing from Office of Water, just to make sure that you're submitting technical assistance questions and requests sort of early and often. And that's exactly like the guidance we're hearing. Kate, I kind of teasing through some of maybe your question. There's eligible borrowers, which is a little more cut and dry, but then there's the eligible project side. And especially now as nature-based solutions continue to become more natural infrastructure and then infrastructure projects, finding ways to talk about those projects in ways that increase the eligibility. So a lot of times we talk about this, biodiversity benefits or ecological benefits, thinking about how we communicate those projects with clean water intent oftentimes can help get those projects more eligible more quickly. So looking at the eligibility requirements and then kind of backing in your project to it, kind of the English to English translation is always really key. That's where that intended use plan and the eligibility for the state is really, really important. And that the technical assistance from the EFCs can really help with that.
So just since you brought that up, the intended use plan was something also that went through my head, and you said the state. So trickle down again. So the municipalities don't have to have an intended use plan?
The intended use plans are developed by the state who administers the state revolving fund. And that's one of those critical documents to be able to unlock the ability to apply for a capitalization grant, which comes from the EPA that would actually fund the program. So each of the municipalities, they're really or originating the projects. The intended use plan is for the administration of the entire fund.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and I just threw this process slide back up to go over those eligible entities. Again, this is a graphic that's available in our toolkit too, which I don't think I actually added to the chat yet. Maybe it's going in there now, but like Erin said, this is meant to be like very much a 101 type resource. So for everyone, recognizing that there are a lot of moving pieces to the administration of the SRFs at multiple levels. And so this is meant to really at least break down the key process points. There's certainly a lot underlying each of these steps and differences between different states and municipalities that we couldn't capture here, but at least it's meant to give you a starting point of where to start looking and who to get in touch with and how to get involved in the process. And I think the other thing to mention that we don't touch on here and what seems to be covered in the webinar that's full next week is how other federal funding sources interact with and can be used alongside the SRFs. And this certainly doesn't go into other state and local funding that's available that is often used alongside the SRFs. So this is really just one piece of the puzzle, but it's a pretty big piece.
I have a question, thinking about the role of the Flood Resilience Network to connect municipalities, and we have members who are elected officials and staff and volunteers, all different types of municipal representatives. from across the region that we convene here. Do you see any role in the state revolving fund process? You know, individual municipalities are responsible for submitting the projects that get on the IUP, right? But would there be any role for an entity like Flood Resilience Network to coordinate intermunicipal opportunities, thinking about flooding in particular? Do you see any role for us as an entity in this process? Providing education opportunities, I think, is one that we can continue to do.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I think step one is making sure that municipalities know that this funding is available and directing them toward resources on how to navigate that process. I think there's probably opportunity too, just for like peer learning and increasing impact by like talking about different programs. If you're experiencing some of the same issues and maybe one municipality has more capacity than the other, like increasing the capacity of the region by supporting each other. I don't know. Those are just some ideas off the top of my head, but.
Bennett?
Just following on that question from Emily, is I don't know if this would be relevant or not, but like if several communities want to share technical assistance, could they, would that strengthen an application to go after some sort of joint technical assistance that could be provided across communities, or any thoughts?
I don't know if Sean, if you have any perspective on that. I don't know if that's something that is commonly done. Or like it also will depend on the state and how they're ranking and prioritizing projects, if that's even like a factor that they're considering when looking at applications. But Sean, do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, no specific examples, just that I've heard this a lot, and I think that this is a lot of these projects are right, like span municipal boundaries, and there's an opportunity to be thinking about these projects sort of at more of a watershed scale. I think these questions and asks for technical assistance would be really welcome in going at it with multiple municipalities. Where it becomes a little more tricky is actually the loan itself and how the project is administered. That's like a whole separate thing. But your question about the TA around multiple entities, multiple municipalities, I think is squarely with what we want to do and what the program wants to do nationally.
But could I ask for a point of clarification on the loan part of this? Just for context, last year, Hudson Valley Stream Conservancy group I'm with partnered with our local town of Ossining, to apply for an SRF grant for clean water, and we got it. It was small, $30,000, but it was an outright grant. Is that kind of thing going to be available this coming year, or has it switched over to this, loan program, other than for the emergent contaminants, which apparently has the 100%, whatever you call it, where you don't have to pay. So other than that, are there going to be any outright grant opportunities, or are they all the loan programs, low interest loans?
The unsatisfying answer is that it depends. And typically it will be through if you're not having to pay back a low interest loan, it will be principal forgiveness of a loan versus an actual grant that's given. Grants are not commonly given through the SRF program. And it's gonna, again, vary on how the state is ranking those projects and determining how much principal forgiveness of loans is given to each of those projects. So I don't have a clear-cut answer for you on that. But some money is available through principal forgiveness of loans. Yeah, I couldn't say if you couldn't, I wouldn't be able to tell you off the top of my head which one would be forgiven or not. Yeah, that goes again through that whole process of ranking them by the state.
Part of my question though was whether there was a distinct change from last year's program to this year's in that regard. No, okay.
No, and I think, yeah, there are two different things that we're talking about here too. We have the base funding for the clean water and drinking water SRFs, which has been around, like I said, for decades, and that funding is still available. And then on top of that, so in some instances, you have a state developing an IUP process for base funding, and then a separate IUP process for bipartisan infrastructure law funding, or maybe just the general supplemental bipartisan infrastructure law funding, and then separate for emerging. It's really up to them how many IUP processes, how they want to break out the different funding that's available and how you apply for it. But no changes to the clean water and drinking water SRF base funding. Some key provisions that make things more accessible and more grants or forgivable loans more available for disadvantaged communities through the bipartisan infrastructure law funding, which goes through 2026. So it was already a complicated process, and now it's even more complicated, but with more money. So
Right.
yeah, it's still a it depends thing, but yeah.
Right, the more money part of that is wonderful. The complexity of it, it's a little overwhelming to know, okay, how do I dive into that? Will there be like, coming from the state or something, or does it filter down to the state? Will they put out like one RFP that we consumers will be become aware of, and then we can, like find our way through it then? Or do we have to look for like 20 different RFP opportunities?
I don't have a clear answer on that, other than I think one of the recommendations we have for advocates, and it's just applicable to all, is to be in touch with your state administrator and build that relationship early and often, because it is not necessarily intuitive finding information on, for example, when and where the intended use plan is being released, and when a public comment period on that might be. So yeah, there's a big need there to just build that relationship and understand the process better, and then connect the key players to them. So
The other piece of that, Gareth, is, while we're talking a lot about the SRF and the administration of the SRF program, there's a lot of other funding and grant programs that are complementary, that are finding their way to all of our communities, NIFWIF being one of the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation and their National Coastal Resilience work, and many other associated grant programs that are looking to fund and trying to draw down the overall project potential of what the cost would be. And a lot of the state SRF programs are becoming more and more aware of these other funding sources that could really kind of help build what we call a capital stack to help get a project done, which may be a little bit cheaper by adding in grant dollars. The other thing that we're seeing, though, as we talk a lot about increased amounts of money and increased grant dollars, while it is free money, it's oftentimes competitive, hard to get, takes a long time. And so kind of thinking about the overall delivery of projects is really key. And that, a lot of communities are debt adverse, but any project you do, today is going to be cheaper than in 5 years. And so there's a way to kind of think about how you structure some of the funding and financing that goes into projects, and the EFCs in each of the, regions, I think would be wildly helpful in thinking through that process.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, I just dropped a link in the chat to sign up for the EFC's email list. I just realized about a week ago that I'm not on it. I think I'm on every other state email list. And so it had slipped my attention, but that's how we found out about that upcoming webinar. They'll be posting lots more information there. So if you want to stay up to date on what's going on at the state level, I think getting on that EFC email list will be really, really valuable.
And I guess one thing just to clarify, Emily, when you're saying EFC, you mean the Environmental Facilities Corporation?
Yeah, sorry, not the Environmental Finance Center.
Just to
Yes.
be clear.
Yeah, thank you, Erin.
That is wildly confusing in New York.
The New York State Environmental Facilities Corporation email list. And I'm actually already on the Finance Center email list, so maybe that was part of the confusion there. Yeah.
Any other questions? I'm sorry that so many of our answers were, it depends.
Well, thank you so much, Erin and Sheyda, for taking the time today at our Lunch and Learn to talk through this process. I think it does depend. It is extremely complicated, but I think the message over and over has been reach out to those technical assistance providers because they're there to help and they'll be able to provide the detail. It sounds like, especially with all of this new funding coming in, they're really waiting and available to municipalities, perhaps in a way that's even more accessible than in the past. So if you have municipal, local government specific questions, make sure you reach out to those folks. We will follow up. We'll send out a copy of the slides so you have all of that detailed information. You can take a closer look at some of those graphics, and then also we will look into that webinar next week that is at capacity, and hopefully we can figure out a way to get that information out to you, either recording or if there's additional spots that are available.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Everyone, happy World Water Day.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.